They met you when you were bleeding, when your voice trembled, when your confidence was cracked, when you doubted your own worth. They learned your weaknesses like a map. They became comfortable with your fear. They recognized you by your hesitation, your silence, your apologies. But what they never understood is that pain does not destroy everyone. Some people are forged by it. The wounded self is not who you truly are, but it often becomes the version of you that the world learns first. It is the identity forged in moments of shock, betrayal, rejection, abandonment, humiliation, and loss. It is the self that emerges when safety disappears and survival takes over. This version of you learns how to shrink, how to stay quiet, how to anticipate danger in every tone of voice and every pause in a conversation. It becomes highly alert, highly adaptive, and painfully misunderstood. The wounded self does not ask, "Who am I?" It asks, "How do I survive this?" When pain first enters your life, it doesn't announce itself as a teacher. It arrives as destruction. It dismantles your innocence, your assumptions, your expectations of fairness and protection. And in that rupture, the psyche creates armor. Sometimes that armor looks like silence. Sometimes it looks like anger. Sometimes it looks like perfectionism, people-pleasing, withdrawal, control numbness, or the constant need for validation. The tragedy is that over time, the armor is mistaken for the person. You are no longer seen as someone who was hurt. You are seen as someone who is difficult, distant, insecure, defensive, dramatic, or weak. But the wounded self is not weakness. It is adaptation. It is the intelligence of the soul trying to stay alive in hostile conditions. It is the nervous system doing its best to protect what remains tender inside. Yet, because this version of you is shaped in crisis, it is always oriented around threat. It scans for danger, even in safety. It overreacts, undertrusts, and hesitates when action is required. It teaches you to expect disappointment before it arrives, to brace for loss before love can fully land. And the longer you live inside this identity, the more it begins to feel permanent. You begin to say things like, "This is just how I am. I'm not confident. I always mess things up. I don't trust people. I'm emotionally cold. I'm too sensitive." But these are not personality traits. These are scar responses. The wounded self becomes an identity only when pain is never given space to transform, when grief is rushed, when betrayal is buried instead of processed, when fear is normalized instead of healed, when survival becomes so familiar that it feels like home. At that point, the wound stops being something you carry and starts being something you live as. And here is the most dangerous part. The wounded self often receives more reinforcement than the authentic self ever did. People learn how to treat you based on your wounds. They learn what you will tolerate, what you will forgive, what you will excuse, what you will endure in silence. Systems form around your pain. Relationships stabilize around your lack of boundaries. And slowly, without anyone consciously deciding it, your suffering becomes useful to others. So you stay wounded, not because you enjoy it, but because the version of you that is hurting is predictable, controllable, non-threatening, easy to define healing. On the other hand, is disruptive. Healing threatens dynamics. Healing rewrites roles. Healing removes access to the parts of you that were easy to manipulate. And the wounded self knows this at an unconscious level. That is why the idea of changing can feel terrifying even when the pain is unbearable. The wounded self also carries shame. not just about what happened, but about how deeply it affected you. You learn to hide how much it shaped your thinking, your attachment, your self-worth. You begin to believe the wound defines your value. You measure your future through the lens of your worst moment. You start to filter every opportunity through the question, what if I fail again? Or what if I'm rejected again? Or what if I'm betrayed again? This is how the past quietly hijacks the future. But the wounded self is only one layer of your identity, not the foundation of it. Beneath the survival patterns, beneath the hypervigilance, beneath the emotional contractions, there is still a deeper self that was never destroyed. It watched everything. It endured everything. It adapted everything. And it has been waiting not for perfect conditions, but for permission to emerge without having to wear armor. The moment you start observing your wound instead of being possessed by it, the identity begins to loosen. You start noticing your triggers without obeying them. You start recognizing your defenses without justifying them. You begin to feel the difference between what is familiar and what is true. And that distinction is the beginning of separation between who you were forced to become and who you actually are. The wounded self clings to old stories because those stories once kept you safe. But safety and growth do not live in the same place forever. What protected you in the past can quietly imprison you in the present. The armor grows heavy. The identity becomes tight. The world feels smaller than your potential, and something inside you begins to ache for expansion, even if you don't yet have the language for it. This ache is not weakness. It is not ingratitude. It is not rebellion. It is the deeper self pressing against the walls built by survival. It is the signal that the wounded identity has completed its job and that something larger is trying to take its place. Not by force, not by destruction, but by slow, terrifying, liberating awakening into a self that no longer lives only to endure, but to choose, to direct, to become, to stand, to be seen without shrinking, to exist without apology, to move without seeking permission, to feel without collapse, to love without abandoning the self, to risk without self-erasure, to speak without fear of disappearance, to grow without needing to confirm the old story, to shed the identity that was born in pain without betraying the version that survived it, to step out of the familiar cage of, this is all I am, and into the unknown truth of who you might be becoming, and the wounded self watching from the threshold, unsure whether to release control or tighten its grip, even further collapse, is the moment when the illusion breaks. It is when the structure you built your life on, your identity, your relationships, your ambitions, your sense of control, can no longer hold the weight of what you have been carrying. Collapse does not arrive quietly. It arrives as exhaustion that sleep cannot cure, as motivation that suddenly disappears, as dreams that feel hollow, as certainty that dissolves into doubt. It feels like failure, but it is not. It feels like loss, but it is not. It feels like the end, but it is not. Collapse is the nervous system admitting that the old way is no longer survivable. Most people spend their lives trying to avoid collapse at any cost. They numb, distract, overwork, perform, pretend, endure. They cling to identities that are killing them slowly because those identities are familiar. They stay loyal to roles that suffocate their spirit because those roles once gave them protection or meaning. But collapse is not punishment. It is the body and psyche withdrawing support from a life that has become misaligned with the deeper self. You do not collapse because you are weak. You collapse because you have been strong for too long in the wrong direction. Before collapse, there is always a season of overextension. You tolerate too much, you ignore too many signals, you compromise your truth too many times, you silence your needs in order to maintain stability. You override intuition to meet expectations. You carry weight that was never meant to be yours, and because you can endure it, you assume you should. This is how collapse is delayed, through endurance that slowly turns into self-abandonment. Then one day, something small breaks you open. A conversation, a loss, a betrayal, a moment of stillness, a sudden failure. Truth you can no longer outrun. And what really collapses is not your life. What collapses is the lie you were living inside. The hidden power of collapse is that it strips away false continuity. It interrupts patterns that were repeating unconsciously. It forces you out of automatic living. It creates a rupture in time where you are no longer able to pretend that everything is fine. This interruption feels humiliating because it exposes the gap between who you were supposed to be and who you actually are. But that exposure is precisely what makes transformation possible. Collapse disorients you so that you cannot go back. It breaks the momentum of a life that was slowly drifting away from your truth. It dismantles the architecture of your ego, the achievements you hid behind, the relationships you lost yourself inside, the roles you confused with identity. In collapse, you are no longer impressive. You are no longer composed. You are no longer certain. And in that stripping, something ancient begins to awaken. Without your usual defenses, you finally feel what has been buried. Anger surfaces, fear surfaces, regret surfaces, longing surfaces. This is not regression. This is excavation. Collapse brings you face to face with the parts of yourself you postponed meeting in the name of survival. It forces you to feel everything you once did not have time to feel. And because the emotions arrive all at once, it feels unbearable. But unbearable is often the threshold of release. The power of collapse is not in how it destroys, but in how it reveals. It reveals where you lied to yourself. It reveals where you stayed too long. It reveals where you betrayed your values in exchange for belonging. It reveals how much of your strength was being spent on holding together a life that was quietly suffocating you. Collapse does not take your power away. It returns your power by removing what was misusing it. In collapse, you lose your future as you imagined it, but you gain your present as it actually is. This is why collapse is often followed by an unfamiliar stillness. The chaos fades, and you are left with nothing to perform, nothing to chase, nothing to prove. The old motivations no longer work. The old fears no longer move you in the same way. You feel empty, but the emptiness is not absence. It is space. Space that was never available while you were running. This space is sacred and terrifying, because now there is no distraction between you and the truth of your life. You begin to question everything that once felt unquestionable. Your relationships, your career, your values, your priorities, your identity. And in these questions, a deeper intelligence starts to surface. Not the intelligence of strategy or survival, but the intelligence of alignment. You begin to sense what drains you and what strengthens you without needing to justify it. You begin to feel when something is wrong without having to rationalize it. Your intuition, once muted by obligation and fear, starts to speak again. Collapse humbles the ego so the soul can be heard. This is why people fear collapse more than they fear slow death, because collapse cannot be controlled. It cannot be staged. It cannot be managed through surface level solutions. It demands surrender, not as weakness, but as honesty. It demands that you stop pretending you know who you are and start listening to who you are becoming. The hidden power of collapse is that it returns you to the raw material of your life, not your roles, not your labels, not your achievements, just your breath, your body, your truth, your unresolved questions. And from that stripped place, something real can finally be built, not a performance, not a survival structure, but a life that fits the shape of who you actually are, not who you were conditioned to be, not who you were afraid to disappoint, not who you needed to become to survive, but who you are beneath the exhaustion, beneath the armor, beneath the borrowed expectations, beneath the identity that once kept you alive, but is now too small to hold what you are becoming. The shadow is not the enemy you were taught to fear. It is the part of you that learned to survive without being seen. It is the side of your nature that was once punished, misunderstood, rejected, or shamed, and therefore pushed into darkness. Anger that was labeled dangerous. Desire that was called wrong. Confidence that was mistaken for arrogance. Sensitivity that was treated as weakness. Over time, you learned which parts of yourself were safe to show and which had to be hidden to preserve love, belonging, or survival. What you repress does not disappear. It waits. The shadow grows in silence, gathering energy in the dark. And because it is denied, it becomes distorted. It leaks out sideways as sarcasm, passive aggression, addiction, self-sabotage, cruelty, envy, control, or the quiet destruction of your own potential. You tell yourself you are being rational, calm, disciplined, or selfless. But the shadow is still driving from beneath the surface, shaping your reactions in moments when you feel out of character. The shadow is not evil, it is powerful. Every trait that was banished carries raw life force inside it. Aggression holds the energy of protection. Desire holds the energy of creation. Pride holds the energy of self-respect. Defiance holds the energy of boundary. Even jealousy contains the signal of unlived potential. The danger is not in possessing these forces. The danger is in being possessed by them unconsciously. When you refuse to meet your shadow, it controls you through impulse. When you face your shadow, it serves you through intention. This is why the shadow is a weapon of growth. Not because it turns you into something harsh or ruthless, but because it returns to you the power that was split off during survival. Growth is not about becoming more light. Growth is about becoming more whole, and wholeness requires retrieving what was abandoned in order to be accepted. You do not integrate the shadow by condemning it. You integrate it by understanding what it protects. Every shadow trait once had a purpose. It arose at a moment when your younger self decided, this is how I will stay safe, or this is how I will not be hurt again, or this is how I will finally be seen. The tragedy is that the strategy kept running long after the original danger disappeared. And what once protected you began to limit you. The shadow becomes a weapon when you reclaim it consciously. When you allow yourself to feel anger without violence, it becomes the power to defend your truth. When you allow yourself to feel desire without shame, it becomes the power to pursue what genuinely matters. When you allow yourself to feel pride without inflation, it becomes grounded confidence. When you allow yourself to feel envy without self-loathing. It becomes information about where your life is asking to expand. The same forces that once sabotaged you can now forge you. But this alchemy requires brutal honesty. It requires you to admit what you have been hiding from yourself. The resentment you deny. The fantasies you suppress. The hunger for recognition you pretend you don't have. The capacity for destruction you would rather not acknowledge. The wish to dominate when you feel powerless. The craving to escape when responsibility feels unbearable. Facing the shadow is not a moral exercise. It is a power exercise. The person who believes they are only good is helpless against their own darkness. They are easily manipulated, easily shocked by their own reactions, easily defeated by impulses they never learned to name. The person who knows their shadow, however, is no longer at the mercy of it. They recognize the surge of anger before it becomes an explosion. They notice the pool of temptation before it turns into compulsion. They feel the rise of envy before it mutates into bitterness. This awareness does not make them saintly. It makes them dangerous in the best way, because they are no longer divided against themselves. The shadow also contains your unlived life. It holds the talents you were discouraged from developing, the leadership you were told to suppress, the creativity that did not fit the rules, the assertiveness that made others uncomfortable, the depth that felt too heavy for the environment you were raised in. All of this was sent underground, not because it was wrong, but because it was inconvenient. And what is buried alive does not die. It waits to be retrieved. When you consciously bring these buried powers back into your life, your growth becomes explosive. You stop asking for permission to take up space. You stop diluting your presence to make others comfortable. You stop apologizing for the intensity of your vision. The energy that once fueled your inner conflict now fuels your direction. This is why shadow work is not gentle, it is not poetic, it is not tidy. It confronts you with your capacity for harm and your hunger for power at the same time. It forces you to see that you are not only a victim of your history, but also a carrier of forces that can shape the future for better or worse. And in that recognition, your innocence shatters. But in its place, responsibility is born. Responsibility is power with awareness. The shadow as a weapon of growth does not make you ruthless. It makes you precise. You no longer swing blindly at the world. You aim. You choose where to apply your intensity. You choose where to draw the line. You choose when to advance and when to withdraw. The same fire that once burned your life down now becomes the engine that drives it forward. The world does not fear people who repress their shadow. The world fears people who have integrated it, because such people do not need to perform goodness. They embody balance. They can be kind without being weak. They can be assertive without being cruel. They can be passionate without being reckless. They can be calm without being passive. Their presence carries weight because it is no longer split. The shadow is the last place you wanted to look, and the first place your real power has been waiting all along. Silent reconstruction is the phase no one applauds. There are no announcements, no dramatic declarations, no visible milestones that others can measure. From the outside, it looks like stagnation. From the inside, it is war. This is the season where the old self is being dismantled quietly, piece by piece, without an audience to validate the struggle. It is the most misunderstood stage of transformation because it lacks spectacle, Yet it demands more courage than any public victory ever could. During silent reconstruction, you stop explaining yourself, not because you are healed, but because you are tired of narrating pain to people who cannot carry it. You move slower, you speak less, you choose solitude not as isolation, but as protection for something fragile that is trying to form within you. This is where the nervous system learns a new language, where survival instincts are questioned instead of obeyed, where the body begins to release patterns it once believed were permanent. Nothing changes on the surface at first. You still wake up in the same room, you go to the same places, you see the same faces, you face the same fears, but beneath that sameness, a different orientation is taking shape. You no longer react as fast. You pause, you hesitate before old habits take control. You feel the impulse to repeat the past, and sometimes for the first time, you resist it. That resistance is reconstruction. That interruption is growth. Silent reconstruction is exhausting because there is no external reward for it. No one sees the boundaries you didn't break. No one notices the urge you didn't follow. No one praises the conversation you chose not to enter, the argument you refuse to escalate, the self-sabotage you quietly disarm. The work happens in the invisible spaces where your character is actually built. This phase is lonely by design. You are no longer who you were, but you are not yet who you are becoming. The familiar world no longer fits, yet the new one has not fully revealed itself. You feel suspended between identities, too aware to go back, too unsure to go forward with confidence. The mind wants clarity, the ego wants reassurance, but reconstruction does not offer either on demand. It only offers process, and process feels like delay when you are used to performance. In silent reconstruction, you start telling yourself the truth without needing to defend it. You admit what drains you. You admit what frightens you. You admit what you want but were afraid to name. This honesty is not dramatic. It is quiet and steady. It shows up in the way you rearrange your days, the way you protect your mornings, the way you close doors without speeches, the way you begin to choose rest over chaos, even when chaos feels familiar. You stop advertising your pain, not because it is gone, but because it is being metabolized. This is where real self-respect is forged. Not in bold proclamations, but in consistent private decisions. You begin to act as if your energy matters even when no one is watching. You begin to honor your limits even when there is pressure to betray them. You begin to choose yourself without needing to announce that you are doing so. Silent reconstruction also rewrites your relationship with time. You stop rushing to arrive. You stop trying to fix yourself on a deadline. You realize that the urgency you felt to become someone else was just another form of rejection toward who you are right now. So you slow down, not because you have given up, but because you have finally stopped running from yourself. The mind resists this slowness. It calls it laziness, it calls it avoidance, it calls it wasted potential. But the body knows better. The body knows that what is being rebuilt cannot be rushed without collapsing again. And so it insists on patience, even when impatience screams. You are not weak in this phase. You are reorganizing power. Silent reconstruction is where your identity stops being negotiated externally and starts being defined internally. You no longer calibrate your worth based on how you are perceived. You no longer shape your choices around who might approve. Your compass slowly turns inward. And at first, this is terrifying because the noise of other people's expectations had always drowned out the sound of your own direction. Now you hear it, not as a command, but as a pull. You don't yet know where it leads, but you know what it leads you away from. This phase also teaches you discernment. You learn the difference between connection and access, between loyalty and self-abandonment, between support and dependency. You stop offering yourself to spaces that only know how to take. You stop explaining your absence to those who never asked how your presence cost you. This withdrawal is not bitterness, it is accuracy. Silent reconstruction is not glamorous. It is repetitive. It is the same choices made again and again without witnesses. It is the courage to be misunderstood for a season while you become unrecognizable for a lifetime. It is the willingness to let people think you have faded when in reality you are condensing into something denser, quieter, harder to manipulate, harder to derail. Your nervous system slowly learns safety. Your mind slowly releases hypervigilance. Your identity slowly detaches from the wound. And as this happens, your presence begins to change in ways even you cannot fully explain. You are less reactive, but more exact. Less visible, but more anchored. Less dramatic, but more consequential. People may think you have lost your fire. What they don't see is that the fire is no longer scattered. It is concentrated. Silent reconstruction is where you become dangerous in a different way. Not through volume, not through force, but through stability, through boundaries that don't shake, through clarity that doesn't argue, through a self-respect that does not need to raise its voice. And one day, without any announcement, without any dramatic reveal, without any need for validation, the world will meet a version of you that was built in quiet rooms, on heavy nights, through private decisions, through the refusal to self-betray one more time, through the slow replacement of chaos with coherence, through the unglamorous discipline of becoming whole, where no one could applaud it. Your comeback does not frighten everyone. It only unsettles those who were most comfortable with your weakness. The ones who memorized your fear, the ones who learned how to speak over your hesitation, the ones who built certainty around your doubt. When you were wounded, you were predictable. When you begin to rise, you become unrecognizable. And what cannot be predicted cannot be controlled. The fear your comeback creates is not fear of your success. It is fear of losing the position they held in your old story. When you were uncertain, others became advisors. When you were broken, others became authorities. When you were silent, others became interpreters of your truth. Your pain created openings for people to step into power over your direction. Sometimes they meant well, sometimes they did not. But either way, a structure was formed where you existed beneath someone else's certainty. And structures resist change even when the foundation is no longer real. Your return threatens the agreement your weakness silently signed. They are not prepared for the version of you who no longer seeks approval before acting. They are not prepared for the version of you who listens inward instead of outward. They are not prepared for the version of you who can say no without trembling, who can leave without explanation, who can hold eye contact without needing to justify existence. This is why your growth is often met with subtle resistance instead of celebration. The jokes become sharper. The doubts become louder. The comparisons become more frequent. The reminders of your past become more public, not because they are curious, but because they are trying to summon the old version of you back into place. The wounded you was useful. The rising you is inconvenient. Your comeback also exposes unresolved fear in others. When someone witnesses your transformation, they are forced to confront what they avoided transforming in themselves. Your discipline mirrors their avoidance. Your boundaries reflect their self-betrayal. Your courage highlights their hesitation. And rather than feel inspired, many feel indicted. Not consciously, but viscerally, your presence becomes a question they cannot answer. This is why some will insist you have changed for the worse. Not because you have become cruel, but because you have become less accessible to their expectations. You no longer bleed openly for their reassurance. You no longer overextend for their comfort. You no longer apologize for taking up space in your own life. And this shift destabilizes the emotional economy they depended on. They were accustomed to your availability, not your alignment. Your comeback also rearranges power without confrontation. There is no announcement, no declaration of dominance, no dramatic reclaiming of the throne. You simply stop shrinking. And in that quiet refusal to collapse, the hierarchy silently collapses instead. You do not need to defeat anyone. Your wholeness does it automatically. The fear your comeback creates is often disguised as concern. You're different lately. You've changed. You're not as warm as you used to be. You seem distant. What they are really saying is, I can no longer reach the version of you that made me comfortable. Distance is not always abandonment. Sometimes it is the measurement of a boundary finally being respected by one side and tested by the other. Your nervous system no longer reacts to the same hooks. Your old triggers no longer guarantee compliance. Your old wounds no longer guarantee access. This is destabilizing for those who built their sense of self around influencing your behavior. Your comeback also frightens the parts of yourself that once survived by staying small. The old instincts whisper that visibility is dangerous, that power invites attack, that certainty invites punishment. Even as you rise, there is an internal tremor that remembers the cost of being seen. The fear outside mirrors the fear inside. And for a moment, both try to negotiate your return. But you do not negotiate with survival anymore. You decide the fear your comeback creates is the final proof that your identity has shifted. If no one felt unsettled, it would mean nothing truly changed. Disruption is the signature of real transformation. When the environment reacts, it is confirming what you already feel in your body, that you no longer occupy the same frequency of existence. Your silence lands differently now. Your absence carries weight. Your presence resets the room, not because you demand it, but because your system is no longer asking permission to exist. Those who once dismissed you now watch you more closely. Those who once instructed you now measure their words. Those who once assumed your limits now hesitate before testing them. Your comeback creates hesitation where there was once entitlement. And hesitation is fear with manners. You may feel guilt for the fear you provoke. This guilt is a residue of old conditioning that taught you to be responsible for other people's comfort. But your evolution is not an apology. It is an inevitability. The version of you that stayed to keep others calm was slowly dying, and your nervous system chose life. Your comeback is not loud. It is not performative. It is not announced on stages or social feeds. It moves through posture, through tone, through decisions that no longer require consensus. You choose differently. You leave earlier. You commit slower. You listen more deeply. You withdraw access more precisely. And these quiet decisions terrify those who lived off your predictability. They do not know how to reach you anymore. They do not know how to influence you anymore. They do not know which version of you will respond anymore. This uncertainty is the death of control. Your comeback will be misunderstood by those who only ever interacted with your wound. They will interpret your steadiness as arrogance, your boundaries as punishment, your independence as betrayal. They will speak about the hold you, as if you are obligated to return. But the old you did not disappear. The old you completed its task. And what replaces survival is sovereignty. The fear your comeback creates is not your responsibility to soothe. It is the cost of no longer abandoning yourself to maintain familiar dynamics. It is the echo of an identity losing its grip on you. And the louder the resistance becomes, the clearer the shift already is. Because people do not fear what is stagnant, they fear what has begun to move.